Abraham Lincoln, the man who saved a nation February 12, 1809, a one-room log cabin in the backwoods of Kentucky. In the harsh wilderness of the American frontier, a child was born who would one day become the most consequential president in American history. A man who would preserve the Union, abolish slavery, and redefine the meaning of democracy itself. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, a story of poverty and perseverance, of ambition and tragedy, of a self-taught lawyer who rose from nothing to become the leader who would guide America through its darkest hour. His life would be marked by relentless personal loss, crippling depression, and political rejection. Yet through it all, he would develop the wisdom, compassion, and moral clarity that would make him one of history's greatest leaders. This is not just the story of a president. This is the story of a man who showed that greatness can emerge from the humblest beginnings, and that integrity and purpose can triumph over seemingly insurmountable obstacles. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born near Hodgenville, Kentucky, on February 12, 1809, to Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln. His father, Thomas, was a carpenter by trade and a farmer by necessity, a man constantly struggling to make ends meet on the American frontier. His mother, Nancy Hanks, came from humble origins, deeply religious and loving despite the hardships of frontier life. Young Abraham had one older sister, Sarah, who was 2 years his senior. The family also had a younger brother who died in infancy, the first of many deaths that would mark Lincoln's life with profound sorrow. Life on the Kentucky frontier was brutal. The Lincoln family lived in a one-room log cabin with a dirt floor, one window and one door. There was no school nearby, no books, and little opportunity for education. Thomas Lincoln, like most frontier parents, was illiterate. Young Abraham would grow up in a world where survival took precedence over learning. In 1811, when Abraham was just 2 years old, the family moved to a farm at Knob Creek, Kentucky. Here, the young boy began forming his earliest memories, working alongside his father in the fields, helping his mother with household chores, and witnessing the harsh realities of frontier poverty. The constant struggle for land ownership plagued Thomas Lincoln. Disputes over property titles were common in Kentucky, where land records were poorly maintained and claims often overlapped. After losing several land disputes, Thomas made a fateful decision. In 1816, when Abraham was 7 years old, the family moved across the Ohio River to Spencer County, Indiana, free territory where slavery was prohibited and land titles were more secure. The journey to Indiana was arduous. The family traveled over 100 miles through wilderness, crossing rivers and navigating thick forests to reach their new home in Little Pigeon Creek. They arrived at a dense forest that would have to be cleared before they could even begin farming. Thomas and young Abraham immediately began the backbreaking work of clearing land. They built a crude three-sided shelter, little more than a lean-to, to protect them from the elements while they constructed a proper cabin. Abraham, just 7 years old, was already working like a man, swinging an axe and helping his father fell trees. It was here, in this isolated wilderness of southern Indiana, that tragedy struck the Lincoln family with devastating force. In the autumn of 1818, a mysterious illness swept through the Little Pigeon Creek community. Settlers began falling ill with violent symptoms, vomiting, tremors, severe abdominal pain, and eventually death. The pioneers called it milk sickness, and they had no idea what caused it. We know now that milk sickness was caused by drinking milk from cows that had eaten white snakeroot, a toxic plant common in the Indiana forests. But to the settlers of 1818, it was a terrifying mystery that killed without warning. Nancy Hanks Lincoln fell victim to milk sickness in early October 1818. She died on October 5, 1818, at the age of 34. Abraham was just 9 years old. Years later, Lincoln would recall his mother's final words to him and his sister Sarah. "Be good and kind to your father, to one another, and to the world." Thomas Lincoln built a simple wooden coffin, and Nancy was buried on a hill near their cabin. There was no minister, no formal funeral, just a family devastated by loss in the middle of the wilderness. The death of his mother profoundly affected young Abraham. He helped his father craft the wooden pegs that held her coffin together, a haunting task for a 9-year-old boy. For months afterward, the family struggled without the nurturing presence that Nancy had provided. Abraham and his sister Sarah tried to maintain the household, but it was nearly impossible. Thomas Lincoln realized his children needed a mother, and he needed a wife. In late 1819, just over a year after Nancy's death, Thomas returned to Kentucky and proposed to Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow he had known in his youth. Sarah Bush Johnston had 3 children of her own from her previous marriage. She agreed to marry Thomas, and in December 1819, she arrived in Indiana with her children, furniture, and household goods, bringing civilization to the crude Lincoln cabin. The arrival of Sarah Bush Lincoln would prove to be one of the most fortunate events in Abraham Lincoln's life. She immediately recognized the intelligence and potential in young Abraham. She brought books to the household and encouraged Abraham's hunger for learning. She treated him as her own son, and Abraham would later describe her as his angel mother. Sarah Bush Lincoln would later say of her stepson, "Abe was a good boy." And I can say what scarcely one woman, a mother, can say in 1,000. Abe never gave me a cross word or look and never refused to do anything I requested him. I never gave him a cross word in all my life. Abraham Lincoln's formal education was minimal, perhaps a total of 18 months of scattered schooling throughout his entire childhood. Frontier schools were rare, poorly staffed, and operated only when no farm work needed to be done. Teachers were often barely literate themselves, but Abraham had an insatiable hunger for knowledge. He would walk miles to borrow books from neighbors. He read by firelight late into the night. His stepmother said he would read everything he could get his hands on, often reading the same book multiple times to absorb every detail. The books that shaped young Lincoln's mind included the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and a biography of George Washington. He also read law books, grammar texts, and any newspaper or periodical he could find. Lincoln developed a habit of writing on any available surface, boards, the back of a shovel, even the bare ground, practicing his letters and working through mathematical problems. He became known for his ability to read aloud dramatically and for his gift with words. As Abraham grew into adolescence, he also grew physically. By age 17, he stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, extraordinarily tall for his era. He was lean, strong from years of farm labor, and known for his physical prowess. Stories spread of Lincoln's ability to lift enormous weights, split rails with incredible speed, and win wrestling matches against the strongest men in the county. But despite his physical strength, Lincoln had no love for farm labor. He later wrote that he worked on his father's farm until age 21, with an axe upon my shoulder for about the best part of my life. In 1828, when Abraham was 19, he had his first opportunity to see the wider world. A neighbor hired him to help transport goods by flatboat down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. The journey was Abraham's first experience of life beyond the frontier, and his first exposure to the brutality of slavery in the Deep South. In New Orleans, Lincoln witnessed slave auctions where human beings were bought and sold like cattle. The experience left a deep impression on the young man, planting seeds of moral outrage that would shape his political future. Tragedy struck again in 1828 when Abraham's beloved sister, Sarah, died in childbirth at age 21. Abraham, who had been exceptionally close to his sister, was devastated. Sarah had been his companion through their mother's death and the difficult early years in Indiana. Her death was another profound loss in a life already marked by sorrow. In 1830, Thomas Lincoln decided to move the family once more, this time to Illinois. At age 21, Abraham helped his family settle in Macon County, Illinois, but he knew his future lay beyond the farm. As soon as he fulfilled his legal obligation to his father, Lincoln struck out on his own. In 1831, Abraham Lincoln settled in New Salem, Illinois, a small village on the Sangamon River. He was 22 years old, with virtually no money, no formal education, and uncertain prospects. But he had ambition, intelligence, and an unshakable determination to make something of himself. Lincoln took various jobs, splitting rails, working as a store clerk, serving as a postmaster, and working as a surveyor. He joined a local debating society, where his skill with words and logic became apparent. His honesty earned him the nickname Honest Abe. After he walked miles to return a few cents, he had accidentally overcharged a customer. In 1832, at age 23, Lincoln made his first attempt at political office, running for the Illinois state legislature. He lost that election, but 2 years later, in 1834, he won a seat as a member of the Whig Party. He was just 25 years old. It was during his time in the legislature that Lincoln decided to become a lawyer. Without money for law school, and with no law school nearby even if he'd had the funds, Lincoln did what he had always done. He taught himself. He borrowed law books from a Springfield attorney named John Stewart, who recognized Lincoln's potential. Lincoln studied Blackstone's commentaries and other legal texts, reading by candlelight in his spare moments. He dissected legal principles, memorized precedents, and practiced arguments. In September 1836, after years of self-study, Abraham Lincoln received his license to practice law in Illinois. He was 27 years old and entirely self-taught. He immediately formed a law partnership with John Stewart in Springfield, the state capital. Lincoln proved to be a natural lawyer. His logical mind, his gift for storytelling, his folksy humor, and his ability to connect with juries made him extremely effective. He rode the judicial circuit, traveling from town to practice law in rural counties, and his reputation grew. During these years, Lincoln also experienced the first of several episodes of profound depression. When his romantic relationship with a young woman named Anne Rutledge ended tragically with her death in 1835, Lincoln fell into a deep melancholy. Friends became concerned he might harm himself. Lincoln would struggle with depression, what was then called melancholy, throughout his life, but Lincoln persevered. By 1840, he had established himself as one of Springfield's most prominent attorneys, handling cases ranging from property disputes to murder trials. He argued over 5,600 cases during his legal career, winning more than he lost and earning the respect of the Illinois legal community. In 1839, Abraham Lincoln met Mary Ann Todd at a social gathering in Springfield. Mary was from a prominent Kentucky family, well-educated, cultured, and politically sophisticated. She was everything Lincoln was not, wealthy, refined, and from high society. Their courtship was rocky. They became engaged, broke off the engagement, and then reconciled. Friends questioned what these two very different people saw in each other. But Mary recognized Lincoln's potential and shared his political ambitions. Lincoln was drawn to Mary's intelligence, education, and social connections. On November 4, 1842, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd married at her sister's home in Springfield. Mary was 23 years old. Abraham was 33. Their marriage would be passionate, tumultuous, and marked by both deep affection and frequent conflict. The couple settled in Springfield, where Lincoln continued his law practice and political career. On August 1, 1843, their first child was born, a son they named Robert Todd Lincoln. Mary was overjoyed to be a mother, and Abraham, despite his often absent-minded nature, was a devoted and playful father. Their second son, Edward Baker Lincoln, was born on March 10, 1846. The Lincoln household was growing, and Abraham's law practice was thriving. In 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Illinois' 7th Congressional District. But the family's happiness was shattered in February 1850 when 3-year-old Edward died, likely from tuberculosis. Abraham and Mary were devastated. Mary fell into a deep depression from which she struggled to recover. Abraham, too, was profoundly affected, though he internalized his grief in characteristic fashion. Later that year, perhaps hoping to heal their loss, Mary gave birth to another son on December 21, 1850. They named him William Wallace Lincoln, called Willie. Willie was an intelligent, sensitive child who would become especially close to his father. Their fourth and final son, Thomas Lincoln, always called Tad because his unusually large head reminded Lincoln of a tadpole, was born on April 4, 1853. With Tad's birth, the Lincoln family seemed complete: Abraham, Mary, Robert, Willie, and Tad. But Lincoln's attention was increasingly drawn to national politics, particularly to the expanding crisis over slavery. Abraham Lincoln had always opposed slavery on moral grounds, but he had not been an abolitionist in the strictest sense. His public position was moderate. He opposed slavery's expansion into new territories, but acknowledged that the Constitution protected slavery where it already existed. Everything changed in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, legislation that opened Western territories to slavery through popular sovereignty. Lincoln was outraged. The act, he believed, betrayed the founding principles of the nation and threatened to make slavery a permanent, expanding institution. Lincoln re-entered politics with renewed passion. He delivered powerful speeches throughout Illinois, articulating the moral case against slavery's expansion. His eloquence, his logical arguments, and his appeal to America's founding ideals drew attention far beyond Illinois. In 1858, Lincoln challenged Senator Stephen Douglas for his Senate seat. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, 7 public debates held across Illinois, became legendary. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Douglas advocated for popular sovereignty and argued that each territory should decide the slavery question for itself. Although Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates made him a national figure. His arguments were reprinted in newspapers across the country. Republican Party leaders began viewing Lincoln as a potential presidential candidate. In May 1860, the Republican Party held its convention in Chicago. Lincoln was not the favorite. That distinction belonged to New York Senator William Seward. But Lincoln's moderate position on slavery, his appeal to Western voters, and his powerful debates with Douglas made him an attractive compromise candidate. On the third ballot, Abraham Lincoln secured the Republican nomination for President of the United States. He was 51 years old. The 1860 presidential election was unlike any in American history. The Democratic Party split into northern and southern factions, each nominating their own candidate. A fourth candidate, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, also entered the race. It was a 4-way contest that reflected the nation's deep divisions over slavery. Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. Southern newspapers denounced him as a black Republican, whose election would destroy the Southern way of life. Threats of secession became commonplace in Southern rhetoric. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States. He won with less than 40% of the popular vote, but carried the Electoral College decisively. He had won without a single electoral vote from the South. The Southern states made good on their threats. On December 20, 1860, before Lincoln had even taken office, South Carolina seceded from the Union. By February 1, 1861, 6 more states had followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. Abraham Lincoln faced an impossible situation. The nation was dissolving, and he had not yet been inaugurated. Would the United States survive, or was the great experiment in democracy about to collapse? Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as president on March 4, 1861. In his first inaugural address, he made his position clear. He had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, but he would not accept secession. The Union was perpetual and indivisible. "We are not enemies but friends," Lincoln declared. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." But his appeals fell on deaf ears. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. The war that Lincoln hoped would be brief became the bloodiest conflict in American history. Over the next 4 years, more than 600,000 Americans would die, more than in all other American wars combined. Lincoln faced impossible challenges. The Union military suffered repeated defeats in the war's early years. His generals proved incompetent or cautious. Public opinion in the North wavered. Political opponents, both Democrats and radical Republicans, attacked him relentlessly. European powers considered recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. And at home, personal tragedy continued to haunt Lincoln. In February 1862, 11-year-old Willie Lincoln fell ill with typhoid fever. Despite the best medical care available, Willie died on February 20, 1862. Abraham Lincoln was inconsolable. White House staff reported hearing the president's sobs echoing through the halls. Mary Lincoln fell into a grief from which she would never fully recover. Yet Lincoln persevered. He expanded presidential war powers, suspended habeas corpus in certain areas, and managed a massive military mobilization. He removed ineffective generals and eventually found capable military leaders in Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Most significantly, Lincoln evolved in his thinking about slavery. Initially viewing the war as a fight to preserve the Union, Lincoln came to understand that the war must also become a fight for human freedom. Slavery was not just morally wrong, it was the root cause of the conflict tearing the nation apart. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory are, and henceforward shall be free. While the proclamation did not immediately free all enslaved people, it transformed the war's moral character. Now the Union fought not just to preserve itself, but to end slavery. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to dedicate a cemetery for soldiers killed in the pivotal Battle of Gettysburg. He was not even the main speaker that day. That honor went to renowned orator Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for just over 2 minutes. His Gettysburg address, just 272 words, redefined the war's purpose and rearticulated America's founding principles. 77 years ago, Lincoln began, dating the nation's birth not to the Constitution, but to the Declaration of Independence and its promise that all men are created equal. He concluded with words that would echo through history. That government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address is now considered one of the greatest speeches in human history, though at the time, many newspapers barely mentioned it. By early 1864, the tide of war began to turn in the Union's favor. Grant's campaigns in the West and Sherman's march through Georgia brought military success. Lincoln became increasingly focused on ensuring that slavery's abolition would be permanent, embedded in the Constitution itself. Lincoln personally lobbied Congress to pass the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery throughout the United States. He made passage of the amendment a Republican Party priority in the 1864 presidential election. That election pitted Lincoln against former Union General George McClellan, who ran on a peace platform. Despite early predictions of Lincoln's defeat, military victories and public support for Lincoln's leadership led to a decisive victory. Lincoln won with 55% of the popular vote and 212 of 233 electoral votes. On January 31, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment by a narrow margin. Lincoln had worked tirelessly behind the scenes, even offering political favors to secure Democratic votes. When the vote was announced, Lincoln reportedly declared it a great moral victory. The amendment would be ratified by the states in December 1865, permanently abolishing slavery in America. Lincoln would not live to see it. By early April 1865, the end of the Civil War was near. On April 9, 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The Union had won. The nation would survive. Lincoln was exhausted but relieved. The war that had consumed 4 years of his presidency and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives was finally over. Now came the hard work of reconstruction, binding the nation's wounds and building a lasting peace. On April 14, 1865, Good Friday, Lincoln and Mary decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The play was Our American Cousin, a popular comedy. Lincoln, who loved theater, welcomed the rare evening of relaxation. What Lincoln did not know was that a famous actor named John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer who had conspired with others to strike at Union leadership, had learned the president would attend. The play. Booth, desperate and fanatical, saw an opportunity. At approximately 10:15 p.m. during the third act of the play, Booth entered the president's box. He carried a single-shot Derringer pistol. He quietly approached Lincoln from behind and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln slumped forward, mortally wounded. Booth leaped from the box to the stage below, breaking his leg in the fall. He shouted Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, before fleeing into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson house, where doctors examined him and determined his wound was fatal. The president, unconscious, lingered through the night. Mary Lincoln, nearly hysterical with grief, kept vigil alongside members of Lincoln's cabinet and friends. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. He was 56 years old. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." John Wilkes Booth was hunted down and killed on April 26, 1865. His co-conspirators were captured, tried, and executed. Lincoln's body was returned to Springfield, Illinois, where he was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery on May 4, 1865. His funeral train had traveled over 1,600 miles, with millions of Americans lining the route to pay their respects. Mary Todd Lincoln, devastated by her husband's assassination and never fully recovered from the deaths of her sons Willie and Eddie. Lived another 17 years in increasing isolation and mental instability. She died on July 16, 1882, at age 63. Abraham Lincoln's presidency lasted just over 4 years. He presided over the nation's greatest crisis and its bloodiest war. He preserved the Union when it seemed destined to dissolve. He ended slavery in America, fulfilling the promise of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. But Lincoln's legacy transcends policy and politics. He showed that leadership requires not just intelligence and determination, but also humility, compassion, and moral clarity. He demonstrated that greatness can emerge from the humblest origins. He proved that self-education and relentless effort can overcome any obstacle. Lincoln's words continue to inspire: with malice toward none, with charity for all. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. His life reminds us that democracy is fragile, that freedom requires sacrifice, and that the work of perfecting our union is never finished. Abraham Lincoln, born in a log cabin, self-educated, marked by tragedy and depression, rejected and ridiculed, became the savior of the American nation and a symbol of human dignity and possibility. His story remains America's story. The belief that in this nation, anyone from anywhere can rise to greatness if they have courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. This is the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. This is why he belongs to the ages.